In the heart of a snowbound Apache camp, the fire roared high, casting shadows over a circle of warriors. Ayana stood alone, her voice steady as she accused the most feared man in the tribe of murder. Gasps rippled through the crowd, the air tightening like a bowstring. Makaro's sneer curled into a predator's grin as he stepped forward, issuing his challenge. The drums slowed, each beat echoing like a war hammer in Samuel Carter's chest. Then, through the wall of murmurs and swirling snow, he emerged from the shadows. Eyes locked on Makaro, Samuel vowed to fight, not just for her freedom, but for her life. What happened next would decide more than love. It would decide their fate. The Montana Territory in January of 1876 was not a place for the faint of heart. For 2 days, the Bitterroot Mountains had been locked in the grip of a storm so fierce it erased all sense of direction. Snow fell in endless sheets, driven by winds that screamed through the pines like a chorus of restless spirits. The world had turned into a shifting maze of white, where trails vanished in minutes and the line between earth and sky blurred until a man could lose himself within 10 steps of his own cabin. Samuel Carter knew these mountains well, yet even he felt the storm's weight pressing on his chest. At 37, he was still strong, but solitude had a way of aging a man in places no mirror could show. His log cabin, perched on a slope above Elk River, had once been built for two. The second chair by the fire now sat empty, holding nothing but the ghost of Clara, his late wife. Years after her passing, her presence still clung to the place, in the quilt folded neatly on the bed, in the faint trace of her handwriting on an old shopping list by the door. His one constant companion in this silent life was Dusty, a steady sorrel gelding who had carried Samuel through storms, rocky passes, and long, lonely supply trips into town. Dusty was more than a horse. He was the last living piece of Samuel's old life, which was why, when Samuel woke that morning to find the corral empty and the gate swinging in the wind, he felt the cold bite deeper than the weather alone. It was foolish to go looking for a horse in a blizzard like this, but foolishness and loyalty often walk the same trail. Samuel pulled on his buffalo hide coat, the heavy kind that could turn the wind, and cinched it tight. A wool scarf wrapped around his mouth and nose kept the frost from biting through, though each breath still burned cold in his lungs. He stepped into the white world, boots sinking ankle-deep into drifts that grew higher with every gust. At first, Dusty's tracks were easy to follow, two neat lines pressed into the snow, angling west toward the river. But halfway down the ravine, something changed. The hoof prints wavered, crossing back and forth as if the horse had been startled. And then Samuel saw them, another set of tracks, smaller, lighter, unmistakably human. He froze, blinking snow from his eyelashes. The prints were bare. No boots, no moccasins. Just the delicate imprint of toes splayed against the ice. The thought hit him hard. No one could survive long in this storm without shelter, let alone barefoot. Whoever made those tracks was either already dead or close to it. Samuel's instincts shifted. Finding Dusty could wait. He followed the human prints, moving as quickly as the snow allowed. They wove erratically through the pines, looping toward a bend in the river where the wind roared like a living thing. There, under the skeletal branches of a willow, something broke the natural curve of the snowbank. A mound. Too even. Too still. He dropped to his knees, brushing snow away with gloved hands. The first thing he uncovered was a corner of woven cloth, faded red and blue in a pattern he recognized from the backs of Apache riders. Beneath it, skin the color of warm earth, cold to the touch, and lips tinted the dangerous blue of a winter sky. Her hair, black as a raven's wing, clung in damp strands to her cheeks. Ayana, he would learn her name later, for now she was simply a life balanced on the thinnest edge. He pressed his ear to her chest. A heartbeat. Weak, but there. That was enough. Without hesitation, Samuel gathered her into his arms. She was shockingly light, as if the storm had already taken part of her away. He wrapped the manta around her, then drew his coat over both of them, pulling her close to shield her from the wind's knives. Snow swirled around them, erasing their shapes from the world. Somewhere beyond the trees, Dusty's faint whinny answered Samuel's sharp whistle. The horse emerged, mane crusted with frost, eyes wide with a mute apology. "Later," Samuel muttered. "We'll settle later." He lifted the girl onto the saddle, climbed up behind her, and wrapped his arms around them both. As Dusty began the slow trek back through the storm, Samuel kept his body hunched forward, making himself a barrier between her and the cold that wanted her. The cabin was still a shadow in the white when they reached it, but inside a fire could be coaxed to life. Inside there was a chance, slim but worth everything, that this girl might wake again. And that was enough reason to fight the storm. By the time Samuel reached the cabin, the storm had worked its way into his bones. He shouldered the door open, the hinges groaning, and stepped inside with Ayanna still cradled against him. The air inside was cold, but it was still a mercy compared to the blizzard outside. He lowered her carefully onto a thick bearskin rug near the hearth, then went straight to the cold hearthstones. The coals were little more than a dull glow, but he coaxed them back to life with pine kindling and a steady breath. Sparks caught, and soon the flames were snapping, chasing the shadows back into the corners. Samuel's hands moved quickly. He unwrapped the snow-crusted manta, then worked at the ties of her soaked dress. His gaze stayed fixed on the task, practical, focused, though the sight of her frost-reddened skin made his jaw tighten. He stripped away the wet layers and wrapped her in every blanket he owned, even the old quilt that still carried a faint hint of Clara's lavender soap. He added another from the footlocker, tucking them tight around her small frame. He brewed a cup of willow bark tea, holding it close to the fire until the steam rose in thin tendrils. Then he knelt beside her, tilting the cup to her lips. At first she didn't respond, her breathing shallow, eyes closed. But then her lashes fluttered, and in an instant she was upright. Her cries shattered the stillness, sharp and high-pitched. She clutched the manta to her chest like a shield, eyes wide and wild. She shouted something in Apache, the same word over and over. "Macaro! Macaro!" Her voice breaking with fear. Samuel raised his hands, palms out. "Easy now. No one's going to hurt you." His voice was low, steady, like speaking to a skittish horse. He stayed where he was, giving her space. He slid a tin cup of venison stew toward her, the scent of meat and sage drifting between them. She eyed it warily at first, then, hesitantly, reached out. The first sip was cautious, the second faster, until the cup was empty. Only then did the tension in her shoulders ease. She looked at him, truly looked, and after a moment spoke. "Ayanna." Samuel nodded once. "Samuel." The wind howled outside, but inside, in the flicker of firelight, the first fragile thread of trust had been tied. In the days that followed, Ayanna's strength returned slowly, like sap rising in a winter tree. She spoke little, but with patient questions, hand gestures, and a handful of shared words, Samuel began to piece together her story. Macaro. Even the way she said his name carried weight, like a rock dropped into deep water. He was a warrior of her people, feared for his temper and respected for his skill with a blade. But respect, she made clear, did not mean kindness. Her father had promised her to him without asking her will, a bargain struck in the name of alliance. She had run before the union could be sealed. Samuel listened in silence, jaw set. When she finished, he said it plain. "No one's taking you back, not while I've got breath in me." For a time, the storm outside seemed their only enemy, but trouble found them sooner than he'd hoped. 3 days after her confession, the knock came. Hard, deliberate, the kind that didn't belong to neighbors. Samuel opened the door to find 2 men dusted in snow, their eyes sharp and measuring. "Looking for a runaway," one said. "Apache girl. $500 if you've seen her." Samuel leaned against the frame, blocking the view inside. "Ain't seen anyone," he said flatly. "Just me here." The men exchanged glances but left without pressing. Still, the cabin felt smaller that night, the shadows heavier. The next time they didn't come asking. They came certain. Snow squeaked under boots as they stepped into the yard. Samuel reached for his rifle, but before he could open the door, Ayanna was there, sweeping past him into the open air. She stood in the snow, hair loose, manta drawn tight around her shoulders. And then she began to chant, not soft, but loud and unshaking. The words were Apache, but Samuel didn't need a translation to feel their weight. Her voice carried like the wind through stone canyons, laced with warning and promise. The bounty hunters shifted uneasily. One spat in the snow, muttered something about curses. Within moments, they were gone, their retreat faster than their arrival. When Ayanna stepped back inside, her eyes met Samuel's. There was no fear in them now, only defiance. The bounty hunter's second visit settled the matter. Neither Samuel nor Ayanna said the words outright, but the look they shared across the fire that night was enough. They could no longer stay. At first light, Samuel laid out saddlebags and began packing. Flour, salt, jerky, coffee, spare cartridges. Ayanna rolled blankets tight, her movements brisk but deliberate, as if each knot tied her further to the decision they'd made. They set out under a sky washed pale with cold. Instead of taking the main trail toward the settlements, Samuel steered Dusty into the thick of the forest, where the pines grew close and the snow muffled their passing. The trees became their cover, the frozen river their guide. Travel was slow but not without purpose. Ayanna began to point out signs Samuel had never truly noticed before. Tiny claw marks in the snow where a squirrel had foraged, the lean of grass frozen beneath drifts, the way the wind funneled through certain gaps in the ridges. "Tracks tell truth," she said in halting English, kneeling to press her fingers into a set of deer prints. She showed him how to judge their age by the sharpness of the edges, how melting snow spoke of hours past. In turn, Samuel introduced her to the saddle in earnest. She'd ridden before, but never for days on end. He adjusted the stirrups to fit her frame and taught her how to lean into the turns, to trust the horse's footing on a descent. One afternoon, when the trail opened onto a stretch of frozen creek bed, he handed her his revolver. "Sometimes noise is the only language men understand," he told her, showing her how to brace against the recoil. Her first shot kicked snow from a log, but her second landed true. At night, they camped where the trees broke the wind. Firelight softened the hard lines of their faces. In the quiet between the crack of wood and the hiss of melting snow, stories began to flow. Ayanna spoke of her mother, how she'd been found dead by the river after defying Macaro, and how the truth had been buried under fear. Samuel told her of Clara's last night, of the raiders and the smoke, and the way the world had gone silent afterward. They did not trade comfort, only understanding. And in that understanding, a bond took root, quiet, unspoken, but strong enough to weather more than the winter. It was on the fourth evening of their journey that they saw him. A lone rider appeared at the crest of a ridge, framed against a bruised winter sky. His horse picked its way down the slope with the ease of one born to mountain trails. Samuel's hand went instinctively to the butt of his revolver, but Ayanna's soft gasp stopped him. "Tarek," she murmured. The man rode closer, a long braid swinging over one shoulder, his face marked with the lines of both age and weather. He reined in a few paces away, his dark eyes fixed on Ayanna. They spoke in Apache first, quick, clipped phrases that Samuel couldn't follow, but he caught the tension in their voices, the weight in the pauses. Finally, Ayanna turned to him, her expression unreadable. "The council calls me back," she said. "They say I must stand before the fire circle." Samuel frowned. "For what?" "To speak," she replied. "To answer why I left. Without my words, Macaro will tell his version. He will say I fled because I feared him, that I shamed my people. If I stay away, he will use my silence as cause for war." Samuel's jaw tightened. Sounds like he's already decided what story he once told. Ayanna's gaze did not waver. "Then I must tell mine. Not to kneel, not to return to him, but to speak the truth where all can hear. Kiss." Tarek shifted in his saddle, watching Samuel carefully. "If she returns willingly, she can face him under the council's law. Refuse, and Macaro will have the excuse he wants to spill blood." Samuel stepped closer to Ayanna, his voice steady but firm. "If you do this, I go with you." Her brow furrowed. "It will be dangerous." "I've lived through danger before," he said, "and I'm not about to let you walk into it alone." Something softened in her eyes then. Not relief exactly, but a quiet acknowledgement of what his words meant. She gave a single nod. "Then we go together." The decision was made without further talk. In the deepening twilight, three riders turned toward the mountains, the cold wind carrying them toward a reckoning that would be witnessed by firelight. The days that followed were measured not in miles, but in the work of sharpening skill and will. Each morning, before the frost had even loosened its grip on the grass, Ayana stood at the edge of camp, a knife in her hand. She practiced throws against the trunk of a weathered pine, the thud of steel into bark punctuating the cold air. At first her aim was wide, her grip uncertain, but by the third morning she could drive the blade deep enough that Samuel had to work to pull it free. Samuel trained alongside her, his own work quieter but no less focused. He sat by the fire pit, running a whetstone over his knife in steady strokes, the rasp of steel on stone keeping time with the distant crack of Ayana's throws. When she paused, he called her over, placing his revolver in her hands once more. "Breathe before you squeeze," he reminded her. "Let the shot surprise you, not the other way around." She frowned in concentration, braced her feet, and fired. This time, the tin can perched on a log spun away in the snow. A small smile flickered at the corner of her mouth. One evening, as the light died early and the fire cast long shadows, Tarek came to Samuel while Ayana slept. The older man stood for a moment in silence before speaking. "You fight for her," Tarek said, not as a question. Samuel met his gaze. "I do." "Then remember this. She does not need you to die for her. She needs you to live. If you fall, she will lose more than a fight." Samuel absorbed the words, staring into the embers. "I'm not looking to die," he said quietly, "but if it comes to it, I won't let him take her." Tarek gave a slow nod, the kind that carries respect. By the time they reached the foothills of the sacred mountain, both Samuel and Ayana carried more than weapons. She carried the weight of her voice, ready to speak before her people without fear. He carried the promise he'd made, silent, unshakable, to stand between her and whatever came through the firelight. They were ready. The fire circle tightened into a wall of bodies, warriors and elders forming a living boundary. Snow fell in lazy spirals, hissing as it touched the heat of the flames. Across from Samuel, Makaro stood like a slab of granite, bare-chested despite the cold, muscles rippling, a long knife gleaming in his hand. His eyes locked on Samuel with the cold certainty of a man who had killed before and expected to kill again. The elder's voice rang out, formal and final. "To the blood." Makaro moved first. His size made him deceptively quick. The first rush came in a blur of motion. Samuel sidestepped, feeling the wind of the blade pass close to his ribs. He didn't counter, yet. Patience, he reminded himself. Makaro wanted to end it in a single crushing blow. Samuel would make him work for every inch. The second lunge came harder, forcing Samuel back toward the fire ring. He caught the slash on his forearm, the sting hot and immediate, but he kept his footing. The crowd murmured, shifting with the rhythm of the fight. Makaro pressed his advantage, driving Samuel back again. Samuel waited, watching, letting the man burn his energy in wide, brutal swings. When a strike came low, Samuel ducked under it and landed a quick cut to Makaro's thigh. It wasn't deep, but it was enough to slow his charge. Breathing hard, Samuel felt the fire's heat at his back. In the ash at his feet, an idea sparked. Makaro came again, eyes blazing. Samuel bent suddenly, scooping a handful of ash from the edge of the fire ring and flung it full into Makaro's face. The warrior roared, blinded, his knife slashing at empty air. Samuel moved in close, driving his elbow into Makaro's gut, then swung the hilt of his knife hard against the side of the man's head. The sound was a dull, final crack. Makaro dropped to one knee, then fell forward into the snow. The fire popped once, like a punctuation mark, before silence claimed the circle. The elders conferred in brief, low voices. Then the eldest among them stepped forward. "Makaro is no longer of the Bear Clan. He is exiled." The warriors dragged him away, his glare fading into the dark. Samuel stood where he was, chest heaving, the heat of the fire and the cold of the snow mixing on his skin. It was over. The fire circle had broken apart, its heat cooling into embers as the crowd dispersed into the shadows of the camp. Samuel sat on the frozen ground, blood seeping through the rough bandage someone had tied around his ribs. The fight's adrenaline had faded, replaced by a bone-deep ache that made every breath feel like gravel in his lungs. Ayana was beside him in an instant. Her hands, warm despite the cold, cradled his face. "You're hurt," she said, her voice low but fierce. "I've been worse," he managed, though the corner of his mouth twisted with pain. Her eyes searched his. as if memorizing him in that moment. Every scar, every line, every proof of what he'd risked. If you live through this night, she hesitated, her voice trembling for the first time since they'd met. I will marry you. A tired smile tugged at his lips. Ayanna, I didn't need a promise to know where I belong. But she pressed her forehead to his, refusing to let him drift into the dark. You belong here, with me. That night the tribe sang, not the songs of war, but the older ones of victory and renewal. Elders moved between the fires, speaking blessings. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when the wind softened and the stars hung low over the mountain, Samuel's breathing evened, and sleep claimed him without the threat of never waking. Spring came slowly to the mountains, but it came. Snow retreated to the highest ridges, and the river broke free of its winter skin, running swift and clear. On a patch of land beside that river, Samuel and Ayanna began to build. The cabin rose log by log, each beam lifted with effort, each nail driven with the rhythm of shared purpose. Samuel's hands, once used to the solitary work of mending fences and splitting wood alone, now worked alongside hers. Ayanna wove new patterns into their manta, each design a record of what they had endured, storms faced, dangers overcome, and the unspoken trust that had carried them through. Some days they spoke little, letting the quiet be a comfort rather than a void. Other days their laughter carried out across the water as they argued over where to place the stove or how high to hang the shelves. Dusty grazed nearby, no longer the lone soul Samuel worried over, but part of a small and growing world. When the roof was finally in place and the hearthstone set, Samuel stood in the doorway and looked inside. The space was simple, a table, 2 chairs, a bed, in the promise of a life made with their own hands. He felt no ghosts there, only the weight of the present. One evening, with the last light pooling gold across the river, Samuel sat at the small table with his leather-bound journal. He dipped the pen, hesitated, then began to write. I went looking for a horse in the snow. I found a warrior instead, and she saved me more than I ever saved her. He closed the book, not to end the thought, but to hold it close. Ayanna stepped through the doorway, her hair loose from the wind, a faint smile in her eyes. He rose to meet her, and without a word they stood together on the threshold, watching the river carry the last of the winter ice downstream. In a land where vengeance had once ruled, they had chosen something harder and infinitely braver. They had chosen to live. In the end, Samuel and Ayanna's story isn't just about survival in the Montana Territory of 1876. It's about something timeless, standing for what's right, even when it's easier to turn away. In today's world, we might not face bounty hunters at our door or blizzards that can bury a man in minutes, but we still face choices that test our courage and our compassion. Samuel chose to risk everything for someone who was, at first, a stranger. Ayanna chose to reclaim her voice in the very place where it had once been silenced. How often in our own lives do we get the chance to speak the truth or to protect someone who can't stand alone? And when we do we take it? Their cabin by the river may be long gone, but the lesson remains. Love and loyalty are built not in comfort, but in the moments when the wind is hardest against you. Now I'd like to hear from you. Do you believe Samuel and Ayanna stayed in those mountains, raising a family in peace? Or did their path lead them back into danger, into another chapter we haven't yet told? Share your thoughts in the comments. Stories like this are richer when we keep them alive together, passing on the lessons they carry. Thank you for riding this trail with us today. If this story stirred something in you, whether it was a memory, a lesson, or a question, please take a moment to subscribe to The West That Never Left. Give this video a like so more folks can find it, and let's keep the spirit of the frontier alive, not just in history, but in how we live and stand for each other today.